It's Big Picture Wednesday. And every Big Picture Wednesday here, we break down the playoff scenarios. Not just the playoff scenarios that we want to talk about. We go to the Twitter sphere, we go to the X sphere, whatever you want to talk about, and we say, hey, what is your most intriguing college football playoff scenario? Because it changes week to week now. As we get more data each weekend, people lose, people win. We kind of get more clarity. But we got three different scenarios I want to talk about right now. And the first one coming from our man, CFB Budge. And this is a friend of the show. Sent us a magazine in the offseason for their own preseason preview, which was phenomenal. So check him out already if you haven't on socials. But his scenario I thought was interesting. He says we got an undefeated Florida State from the ACC. You got Ohio State as your Big Ten champ. And you got Washington as your Big Ten champ. So 3 undefeated champions from those 3 conferences. Then he says we got a 1-loss Big 12 champ and a 1-loss SEC champ. In Alabama, I'm assuming they were beating Georgia. So the question here that he asks is, does the committee respect head-to-head? Now, what I think would happen here, if all things were to be even, if we don't see some drastic data point like Bama blows out Georgia or Texas, blows out whoever they play in the Big 12 title game or whatever, like if we don't see anything drastic on the data points and we kind of see it stay fairly steady across the board, I think Texas would be in. Now, have they looked as dominant as we saw week 2 in Tuscaloosa? Not necessarily, but I do think you have to say, hey, the resume is what the resume is. That head-to-head winning double digits in Tuscaloosa, like you have to respect that, okay? So I think they would respect that. Now, again, going back to that caveat, the eye test is going to matter here. So the reason why I think it's going to matter here, because as much as we've said about the inconsistency of the committee, they have told us they care about the eye test a lot. And the reason we know that is Georgia was up to number 1 2 weeks ago, jumping over Ohio State when Ohio State still, in my opinion, had a arguably better resume. Oregon, the highest one-loss team, or the highest ranked one-loss team right now in the country at number 6. Their resume, I don't think, is quite as good as an Alabama or as good as a Texas, but the eye test, they care about that with Oregon. Michigan at number 3, they have 1 ranked win, the eye test. So the eye test matters a lot to this committee. And so if Alabama were to put something on tape and show the committee, hey, we are emphatically a top 4 team. And that would look like, again, a 10-point or more margin of victory over Georgia in Atlanta. And let's say Texas kind of looks shaky against Texas Tech. They win by a score. Kind of looks shaky in the Big 12 title game. They win by a score. If we find ourselves in that situation with a convincing Bama win over Georgia and Texas not really earning too many style points, at that point in time, I think Bama would jump Texas. Now, is it fair? I don't know about that, but I think that's what would happen. So in that scenario, again, all things even, I think you respect head-to-head. But if you get something drastic here, if I cannot get out of my mind the scenario where Alabama somehow convincingly beats Georgia in Atlanta, and that's the last thing you tell the committee before they make the decision on Selection Sunday. Like that snapshot, I think, would matter a lot to the committee by nature of what we've seen matter to the committee to this point. And I think it'd be hard for them to just kind of turn a blind eye to that and look back to week 2. Recency bias, again, whether it's fair or not, I think it matters to these folks. All right, now scenario 2 from our guy Liam Neighbors. We spent probably about a half page of notes here. I felt like I was doing long division trying to figure this one out. Liam Neighbors has said Oregon State beats Oregon this weekend, but Oregon still plays for a Pac-12 championship. So we're assuming in this situation, Arizona ends up losing. So Oregon, they still find themselves in Vegas, playing Washington. And then Oregon beats Washington as a 2-loss Pac-12 champ, is what we have in that conference from Oregon. And then he says Texas, they catch a second loss somewhere along the way. So let's just say, for instance, Texas loses to Texas Tech this weekend. I'm not predicting it. I'm just saying for the sake of this conversation, the Big 12 then somehow, some way has a multiple loss Big 12 champ. Okay, so if you're keeping track now, Pac-12, 2-loss champ, Big 12, multiple loss champ as well. And then he says you have Alabama winning the SEC with 1 loss. So we're assuming there they beat Georgia. Not assuming, we know that that's the matchup we got there. So they're a 1-loss champ over Georgia, meaning they beat Auburn this weekend. So you have a 1-loss SEC champ in Bama, multiple loss Big 12 champ, and Oregon is your 2-loss Pac-12 champ. Now that's all he gives us in this scenario. So I'm going to go ahead and assume that we get an undefeated Florida State and we get an undefeated Ohio State or an undefeated Michigan as our Big 10 champion. All right, so just to kind of keep that neat and tidy. Who gets in? All right, let's kind of stretch here a little bit and really put on the thinking cap. The Big 10 champion, obviously, you're in. The ACC champ, obviously, undefeated Florida State, you're in. I think a one-loss SEC champ, Alabama, I think you're in. I think from what we've seen from the committee over the last couple of years, I understand it's a different committee, but just from what we know about the college football playoff, no two-loss team has ever made it. So Oregon, two-loss champ, I think they're out. A multiple-loss Big 12 champ, I think they're out. So then to choose from for that fourth spot, we have to pick from 3 one-loss non-conference champions. All right, so that's a one-loss non-conference champion Washington, a one-loss non-conference champion Georgia, and a one-loss non-conference champion, didn't even play for their conference championship, actually, Ohio State. How do we pick this? How do we decide? Well, I think for this point, got to go resume and eye test, the two things that matter to the committee. What does the resume say? When it comes to Washington, they have 4 ranked wins. Okay, 4 ranked wins, one of those being in the top 10 over Oregon. Georgia would have 4 ranked wins, one of those being in the top 10 over Ole Miss. Ohio State, they don't have as many ranked wins, but they do have 2 top 10 wins, one of which being on the road against Notre Dame, one of which being at home against Penn State. And then arguably they have the best loss of this whole group, being to a top 3 Michigan. Okay, now you say they didn't play for the Big Ten championship. Okay, I understand. But still, that resume, I think, still holds some weight. Like, I don't think the 2 top 10 wins is a drastic drop-off from the 4 ranked wins those other teams have. So, where does that leave us? When I look at these resumes, I think you can make an argument for all of them. We just made the argument for Ohio State. Those 2 top 10 wins should hold a ton of weight. Their loss should hold a ton of weight. They have the best loss of this whole group. Georgia, Washington, the same amount of ranked wins. They both have a top 10 loss in this case. Like, they both played for the conference championship. So what I think you would do then is you look to the eye test. And the eye test is hard to quantify based on the fact that these games haven't actually happened yet. So it would be something to guess at, I suppose, at how those games would turn out. But again, going back to what we know already about the committee. The committee is telling us right now they really value the way that Georgia has looked to this point in the season. And if we find ourselves in this scenario, I think Georgia, as a one-loss non-conference champion, depending on how that loss looks to Alabama, I think they'd be the team that gets in. Now, you could go down the rabbit hole and say, well, if Ohio State gets blown out by Michigan and Georgia gets blown out by Alabama and Washington loses by 3 to Oregon, maybe they find their way in. But again, I'm going back to chalk kind of holding here and assuming they all lose by a touchdown to whoever their losses to, Washington to Oregon, Ohio State to Michigan, and Georgia to Bama. If it's a one-loss or a one-touchdown loss across the board, I think Georgia, and honestly, let's just be real here, the good faith that I think that the Georgia brand has, right or wrong with the committee, I think we see a little Georgia bump and we find them as that 4th team in that scenario. So things are getting weird right now in this playoff scenario segment, and we got one more for you, but I appreciate y'all that have already submitted some scenarios. If you haven't yet, go ahead and do that. We'll get to those next week at this time, and we'll have ourselves a good time breaking it down. Last one here, and this scenario got its own page. Like, I mean, we did a full-on break it down. I felt like I was solving a math problem as we go through these. Justin Armstrong. Like, some men, they just want to watch the world burn, and Justin is one of those guys. He hit us up and said, okay, here's the deal. Bama, one-loss conference champ. A lot of these involve Bama. I don't think that's coincidental because that is really the chaos block that could set this whole thing off. One-loss conference champ, Alabama, from the SEC. Louisville, a one-loss conference champ from the ACC. Okay, so they beat Florida State in the conference title game. Here's where it gets real crazy. My man Justin says Iowa wins the Big Ten. So they beat an undefeated, let's say, a Michigan or Ohio State. We'll get to that here in a second. Then Oregon. He kept this neat and tidy for us, so thank you, Justin. Oregon's a one-loss conference champ from the Pac-12. And then similar to our last scenario, he has Texas somehow dropping a game here and the Big 12 champ being a multiple-loss team. So you got a multiple-loss Big 10 champ, a multiple-loss Big 12 champ, and then you got Louisville out of the ACC as a one-loss conference champ. So let's just break this down the best we can. I think Oregon, again, based on what the committee has told us to this point, they like them on the eye test. I think with the resume and freezing their wins with a ranked win, say what you want about Colorado. They were top 20 at the time. Say what you want about Utah. They were top 20 at the time as well, and they beat them on the road. That probably helps the resume. Obviously, if they beat Washington, that boosts the resume even more. I don't see a way where you leave them out in this scenario. Alabama, if you beat the number 1 team in the country in Georgia, In this scenario, you're in. Okay, so those two are locked. So who's left? A one-loss non-conference champion Michigan or Ohio State. Ohio State has the best resume there for the Big Ten, so we'll talk about that here in a second. A one-loss non-conference champion Georgia and a one-loss conference champ Louisville. I think those are the teams that you pick from. You also, I guess, have a one-loss non-conference champ Washington. I would take a one-loss Michigan or Ohio State, and we'll talk about that in a second here. Like I said, I'll take those teams, eye test and resume, over what Washington's done to this point. So I think Louisville, like here's my thing. The committee, every single year, regardless of who's a part of it, the college football playoff values conference championships. If Louisville wins the ACC with one loss and they're a Power 5 one-loss conference champ, there would be riots in Louisville, Kentucky if they don't find their way into the college football playoff. Like I think that would just go against everything that we've known about this college football playoff structure if you leave a one-loss Louisville out of the dance. Now, I understand we're going to have a conversation here about eye test versus resume because Ohio State, Georgia, Michigan, all three of those teams probably are better than Louisville, just to be real. If they were to play tomorrow, I think you'd probably take Georgia, or you take Ohio State, or you take Louisville, or you take Michigan over Louisville. So that leaves us with Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State. I think Ohio State has a better resume than Michigan at this point in time. Let's just call it, for the sake of tidiness for this conversation, let's say Ohio State is the team that makes it to the Big Ten championship game with one loss. Ohio State's resume would then be 3 top 10 wins: Notre Dame, Penn State, Michigan. Georgia, they've got a really solid resume. They would have, I think, 4 ranked wins at this point, 1 top 10 win, but the resume and the eye test for Ohio State, assuming they beat Michigan, would make them that last team to get in. Now, going back to this, that would be Oregon, Bama, Louisville, Ohio State in that predicament with those 4. If you're pushing back on Louisville, I understand, because we will find out now, if we get this scenario, how much you want to value eye test over resume. Because eye test, far and away, Georgia would get in over Louisville. Resume, the conference champion thing, I think would ultimately be the one that keeps them in. So those are the playoff scenarios that y'all brought to us, and we appreciate y'all doing so. We want to unpack this every single week on Big Picture Wednesday. So get those in via Twitter. I mean, you can Instagram those, DM me to me as well, at JD Piquel. But let me know what y'all think about these different playoff scenarios. It gets weird. It's going to get weirder here as we get through this rivalry weekend. But it feels like every single Selection Sunday, we sit down, we know what to expect, and we get what we expect when it comes to those top 4. So that's how we think those scenarios will play out. But a lot of weird ahead of us, and a lot of weird I'm sure that we're going to have to talk about here going forward, especially after this weekend. Hey y'all, thanks so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel here to make sure you don't miss an episode of The Hard Count. Also be sure to check out other videos on the On3 YouTube channel.